His secret lingered in every raindrop. Welcome to Mind Night Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Your voices make these mysteries come alive. Now the story unfolds. Oxford, at its quietest, holds its breath. There is something about the city when the rain falls gently upon its ancient stone, something that wraps the streets in a veil of reverence. It was late, of course, the kind of hour when only a few stragglers remain, the soft echo of footsteps lost against the rhythm of the rain. I'd wandered through the city aimlessly, as one does on evenings like this, when the mind becomes restless, too tired to think, but too alert to let go of the world entirely. The air was thick with that wet smell, damp stone, wet earth, the faint scent of distant, unlit fireplaces. It always reminded me of the past, of memories I couldn't fully name. The cobblestones were slippery beneath my shoes, yet I walked with a deliberate pace, as if the city had, in some way, asked me to pause and listen. It is in these moments, when the rain softens the edges of the world, that the stories of Oxford seem to speak most clearly, even if they are never entirely understood. Perhaps it was the city's history, or the simple loneliness that lingers between the arches and the spires, but I couldn't shake the sense that there was something waiting to be revealed. It was during these slow, meandering walks that I allowed my thoughts to wander, free from the pressing demands of work. The case, of course, was still in my mind. Professor Jonathan Carver, the sudden death, the mystery that seemed to thicken like fog with every passing day. But it was more than that. It was always more than just the facts, the cases, the clues. Oxford had a way of unearthing one's thoughts in the strangest of ways, pulling old memories and unresolved feelings from where they had been quietly buried. I stopped for a moment by the edge of a stone bridge, watching the water below. It moved slowly, as if caught in some moment of suspended animation, its surface shimmering faintly in the streetlight. The canal had always been a place for quiet reflection, though there were few who noticed its presence in the middle of their busy lives. Yet for me, the stillness of that water mirrored something deeper, an undercurrent that tugged at the edges of everything. The case was more than just a death. There were layers to it, each more elusive than the last, and as I stood there, I couldn't help but wonder what had drawn me so deeply into it. What was I hoping to find? As I turned to leave the bridge, the faintest of sounds caught my ear, the rustle of an umbrella, the soft tap of shoes on the wet pavement. I'd not heard anyone approach, and yet there she was, walking toward me with a purposeful stride, her silhouette barely visible through the mist. Dr. Rosalind Trent. I'd seen her only briefly, in passing during my initial inquiries into Carver's death. She had struck me then as something of an enigma, poised, professional, but distant, too distant for someone so heavily involved in the case. She stopped a few feet away, her face half obscured by the brim of her umbrella. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I had a vague sense that she, too, had been caught in that same web of thoughts, the weight of Oxford's history and secrets pressing down upon us both. The rain was softer now, the kind that makes everything seem distant and muted. "Morse," she said at last, her voice soft but clear, the tension in her tone betraying something more beneath the surface. "I thought I might find you here." "I've been wandering," I replied, watching her carefully, the steady tap of her umbrella against the stone ground punctuating the silence. "Oxford has a way of making you do that. Draws you in, doesn't it?" "I'm not so sure it draws everyone in," she said, a hint of irony in her voice. "For some, it's just a place to pass through. For others." She let the thought trail off, as though the rest was too obvious to say aloud. I nodded, my attention flicking to the faintest shift in her posture. She was hiding something, of course, but I wasn't sure whether it was something personal or something more connected to the case. I'd already noted the strain in her voice when we'd last spoken about Carver, the way she had deflected any suggestion that their relationship had been anything more than professional. There was more to her than she let on, and it was that subtle complexity that intrigued me. "What brings you out here in the rain, Doctor?" "Trent," I asked, my voice casual, but my eyes searching. She hesitated, then glanced up at the dark sky as though gathering her thoughts. Perhaps I needed to clear my mind. Oxford has a way of becoming too... She paused, looking for the right word. Too heavy, sometimes. Even for those who have lived here for years, it was a telling admission. For someone who lived and worked within the cloistered world of academia, where the past and the present are often indistinguishable, the weight of Oxford could become a heavy burden. It had a way of pressuring its inhabitants, bending them beneath the weight of knowledge, secrets, and history. "I suppose I know what you mean," I said, the words lingering between us. I was watching her closely now. There was something else, something I couldn't yet name, but it was in the way she looked at me, just for a second too long. It was as though the rain had washed away the mask she had worn so carefully in the days prior. We stood there in the rain for a long moment, both of us silent. Neither of us said anything further. Neither of us needed to. It was as if the rain itself had given voice to everything unsaid, things we would both, in time, have to acknowledge. The city would not let us forget, nor would the case. Eventually, she nodded, her expression unreadable once more. "I'll see you soon, Inspector," she said. And with that, she turned and walked away, the soft click of her shoes fading into the mist. I watched her disappear into the fog, then turned and began to walk in the opposite direction, the cool air settling around me once more. The city felt just a little bit smaller now, but no less mysterious. The rain was still falling, but it no longer seemed to matter. There was something about Oxford on nights like this, something that made everything clearer, yet more distant at the same time. Perhaps I would understand in time, or perhaps I would never fully comprehend the weight of the secrets it held. The university had its rhythms, its routines that were as predictable as the turning of the seasons, but on this particular morning, something felt different. It was subtle at first, an imperceptible shift in the air, like the moment before the storm. The students walked by in their usual hasty shuffle, their expressions a blur of distracted thought, lost in the frenzy of their own minds. But something lingered, something unspoken. Professor Jonathan Carver had been scheduled to give his final lecture that day, and the topic was peculiar, even for him. A last foray into the realms of mysticism, something of a departure from his usual academic path. The world of 18th century philosophy had become, to him, too narrow, too confining. He had, for the past several months, seemed preoccupied with something more elusive, something darker. I was not invited to the lecture, of course. That was not the nature of my work. But I knew Carver's reputation, his brilliance, his eccentricities. I had seen him at lectures in the past, the way he could lose himself in his own thoughts, his voice rising and falling with that mixture of passion and detached precision. But that morning, I had the distinct sense that his lecture would be different, not just in subject matter, but in tone. And as it turned out, I was right. I arrived at the lecture hall a few minutes before the students began to trickle out, their faces pale, expressions unreadable. A few of them lingered by the door, their eyes furtive as they avoided meeting my gaze. It was clear that something had happened. Something had shifted in the space they had just vacated. I pushed open the door and entered, and there, at the podium, stood Carver, dead. The room was still, a silence that was almost too profound. His papers were scattered across the desk in front of him, his books half open, as though he had simply collapsed, mid-thought. The lecture notes, those chaotic, frantic pages that had accompanied him throughout the lecture, were still in disarray, strewn about, and yet there was something almost serene about the way he had fallen. It was as though he had simply stepped out of the world he had so often occupied and into some other, quieter place. The police had already arrived by the time I made my way to the higher front of the lecture hall. They had confirmed what I had already suspected. A sudden heart attack, an unfortunate end to a man who, though certainly no stranger to academic tension, had lived, by all accounts, a life of intellect and solitude. But as I observed the scene, as I noted the subtle disarray of his notes, a thought nagged at me. There was something more here, something that went beyond the obvious. There were too many unanswered questions for it to be just an unfortunate collapse. One of the students, a young woman with dark hair and a nervous gaze, approached me hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly around her notebook. She spoke in low tones as though afraid of being overheard. She told me that Carver had seemed different during the lecture, not just in terms of subject matter, but in his demeanor. He had been agitated, distracted, even uncharacteristically cryptic. She said something that stuck with me, a remark about Carver mentioning secrets buried too deep and how no one would understand, not yet. I let the words hang in the air. No one would understand, not yet. I wondered if those words were more than a passing remark, a moment of his characteristic flair for the dramatic, or if they had been an expression of something darker, something he had been wrestling with in his final days. I glanced down at his desk, at the pile of papers and books, and I noticed, almost hidden beneath the pile, a thin, crumpled envelope. It had not been there earlier, I was sure of it. I picked it up, feeling the paper, almost weightless in my hands. There was no name on it, just the faint impression of the ink, smudged as though it had been pressed against something, hidden in haste. The contents were simple, a short note, but they revealed something startling. The truth will remain buried until the storm clears, but it will come, in time. And when it does, no one will be safe. The words were not a confession, but they were a warning. It was clear now. Carver had known something that he had feared, perhaps something that had driven him to that strange final lecture. He had been trying to warn someone, or perhaps himself, but he had been too late. The truth had already begun to unravel, just as I had arrived. I left the lecture hall soon after, the weight of that envelope still in my hand. Carver's death was not an accident. His final words, his cryptic message, suggested that something much darker had been at play, something that extended far beyond the walls of this particular lecture hall. The storm, as he had so delicately put it, was far from over. The clouds had gathered, and I could feel the first drops beginning to fall. And yet, as I walked through the damp streets of Oxford, the truth felt distant, more of a shadow than a reality. Whatever secrets Carver had been hiding, they had found their way into the rain, where they could be easily forgotten. But not by me. Not yet. It was, as it often is, the smallest of details that led me further down the path, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. I had spent the day walking the halls of St. Alphege, studying the life of Professor Carver as though it were a puzzle I might yet piece together. But I could not escape the sense that the answers I sought were hidden, perhaps deliberately, in plain sight. The usual rhythm of my investigation had begun to shift from methodical inquiry to something more elusive, a creeping feeling that I was missing something profound, something that seemed to slip away the moment I approached it too directly. It was late when I found it, an old manuscript tucked away in the back of Carver's office, hidden among the piles of books and papers that had been left undisturbed for far too long. I had assumed at first that it was simply another one of his academic writings, a collection of notes or drafts for yet another obscure thesis on 18th century philosophy. But as I pulled the leather-bound volume from the shelf, I felt a strange weight to it, heavier than the rest. There was a sense of significance to it, as though it had been waiting for me to discover it. I settled into the worn chair at Carver's desk, the familiar scent of dust and ink filling the air. The office was unremarkable in its disarray, the kind of academic chaos that is as familiar to me as the creak of Oxford's stone buildings. But this manuscript, this particular object, felt different. I ran my fingers over the pages, their edges yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places as though it had been handled too often. The title was not one I recognized, nor was there a date. Just a simple inscription in Carver's unmistakable hand: The Path to Knowledge and the Cost of Truth. I opened it carefully, as though afraid the fragile pages might crumble under my touch, and began to read. It was clear from the first few lines that this was not just another academic treatise. The words, though grounded in intellectualism, began to take on a more personal, almost feverish tone as I read on. Carver's voice seemed to change within the pages, an intellectual rigor giving way to something more raw, something bordering on obsession. He spoke of secrets, of hidden knowledge, of truths that could not be uttered aloud without dire consequence. And yet, despite the urgency of his words, there was something disturbingly detached about the way he wrote, as though he were observing these thoughts from a distance, not fully part of them. I paused on one particular passage, a reference to something I could not place immediately. It was a phrase Carver had used before in his lectures, one that had struck me as peculiar, but now it seemed more than just a passing phrase. He had written, "The secret lies buried beneath the stone, but it is the stone itself that must be turned." The words were cryptic, and though they seemed to echo something I had heard from him previously, I couldn't quite grasp their meaning. I turned the page, hoping to find more context, but there was nothing. Just an abrupt end to the passage, as though he had stopped mid-thought. I set the manuscript down for a moment, allowing the weight of its words to settle in the silence of the room. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea of a secret buried beneath a stone. It was the kind of thing one might find in a story, not in the work of a respected academic. But Carver had not been merely an academic, had he? There was something darker beneath the surface of his intellect, something that he had concealed even from those closest to him. As I continued to leaf through the manuscript, I found no further clues, only more scattered thoughts, more fragments of unfinished ideas. It seemed as though Carver had been on the verge of something profound, perhaps even dangerous, and had abandoned it before it could be fully realized. But the more I read, the more I began to wonder if the manuscript itself was part of the puzzle. Had Carver left this behind on purpose, knowing that someone might come searching for answers after his death? Or had he simply lost his way in the process, leaving his thoughts unfinished, his final work in tatters? I left Carver's office that evening with more questions than answers, the manuscript still tucked beneath my arm. The rain had started again, the city wrapped in a misty blanket that seemed to blur the line between reality and something else. Something deeper, more elusive. As I walked through the damp streets of Oxford, the weight of the manuscript felt heavier than ever. There was something hidden in those pages, something Carver had known but had not revealed. And it was that secret, I realized, that would lead me further into the heart of this mystery. Perhaps it was the rain, or perhaps it was the weight of the past itself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into a story that was far older than I had first imagined. And yet, with each step, the answers I sought remained just out of reach, waiting, like the rain itself, to be understood only when the time was right. It is strange how the mind works when it is not quite ready to grasp something, yet lingers on the edge of understanding. I'd been to Dr. Clara Milton's office more than once by now, each time under the same pretext. Polite conversation, the exchange of academic pleasantries, the usual professional niceties. And yet there was something about her, some subtle flicker of discomfort in her eyes, that told me she was hiding something, perhaps not even from me, but from herself. The day I went to see her after finding Carver's manuscript, I was determined to see her in a new light. No longer would I approach her as a mere academic, a colleague of the late Professor Carver. I had to look beyond her sharp intellect and carefully crafted facade to find the truth that lay behind it all. I'd seen that she was unnerved by Carver's obsession with the occult, but I had yet to understand just how deeply that obsession had touched her life. I walked the familiar corridor, my footsteps measured, the creaking floorboards beneath me like the faintest whispers of a long-forgotten past. It was the same passage that led to the lecture halls, the same passage that I had walked so many times before, but today it seemed different, like a threshold I had yet to cross. Her office, as always, was a small room lined with bookshelves that seemed to lean slightly, as though tired from bearing the weight of years of knowledge. The heavy scent of old paper hung in the air, mixed with the faintest trace of lavender. She was sitting at her desk when I entered, her posture as composed as ever, her eyes carefully studying the papers in front of her. The moment I stepped across the threshold, she looked up, her expression unreadable, but her eyes, those eyes, had that fleeting moment of recognition that I had come to associate with her secrets. "I wasn't expecting you today, Inspector," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. I thought I detected a slight tremor in her hand as she set down her pen, but it was gone before I could be certain. "No, Doctor." "Milton," I replied, "but I do tend to drop in unannounced from time to time, don't I?" I smiled softly, though I knew it was only a formality. There was nothing casual about this visit, not this time. She seemed to accept my words at face value, though her lips pressed into a tight line as she gestured for me to sit. "How can I assist you today?" she asked, her tone polite, but there was an underlying tension that clung to the words. I glanced at the scattered papers on her desk, not so much reading them as allowing my eyes to wander over the chaos. It was the kind of disarray that bespoke intellectual fervor, or, in some cases, intellectual avoidance. Her academic life was spilling over into every corner of her office, and yet there was something in the space that suggested a mind in turmoil. "I've been looking through some of Professor Carver's old works," I began, keeping my voice deliberately casual, "and I found something interesting. A manuscript, to be precise." I let the words hang in the air, watching her carefully for any flicker of recognition. She did not flinch, but I could see a subtle shift in her expression, something akin to wariness. She didn't say anything at first, but I could feel the tension in her stillness, as though she were calculating her next words with great care. "I'm sure it was nothing more than academic ramblings," she said finally, her voice smooth, but there was a faint edge to it. Professor Carver had many unfinished projects in his later years, all of them eccentric. "I believe you'll find no hidden meaning there." I wasn't convinced. Her response was too practiced, too rehearsed. I could sense her reluctance to discuss the manuscript further, as though it was something too personal for her to confront directly. There was a history between her and Carver, of that much I was certain. But how deep did that history go? "I would like to hear your thoughts on it, Doctor." "Milton," I said quietly, leaning forward slightly, "it seems to me that Carver was on the verge of something important, something beyond his usual academic pursuits." At the mention of Carver's work, her fingers tightened on the edge of the desk. The slightest of gestures, but it told me more than she intended. She was not just a colleague in this. There was something else. A connection, an attachment that made her uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I can't offer much insight on his final work," she said, her voice a shade too cold. "Carver and I had disagreements, philosophical differences mostly. He became fixated on certain subjects that didn't sit well with me." She paused for a moment, the silence between us stretching out. "He was always chasing after something that couldn't be found, something that was better left untouched." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. She had known something, or at least suspected something. I could feel the walls she had built around herself, but they were beginning to crack, just slightly. Her discomfort was more than intellectual. It was personal, and it ran deeper than Carver's eccentricities. But what was it? "I understand," I said, my voice soft, as I stood up to leave. "But I'll be back, Doctor." "Milton, there are things I still need to understand about Carver's final days. I'll need your help, whether you offer it willingly or not." I turned to leave, but paused at the door. "One last thing, Doctor." "Milton," I added, "you mentioned something better left untouched. Is that how you feel about the truth of Carver's death?" She didn't respond, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching, perhaps wondering whether I had seen too much or not enough. And for the first time, I wasn't sure whether I was walking away from a woman in control of her secrets, or one who was about to lose control of them entirely. As I stepped into the quiet hallways of the college, I felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on me. Dr. Milton's shadow loomed larger now, but whether it was a shadow of guilt or something more was still unclear. But I would find out. I always did. I'd always thought of debts as something tangible. Figures written down on a ledger, sums that could be settled in coin or contract. But the truth of it, I was beginning to understand, was far less clear-cut. Some debts are far older than the present, buried deep beneath layers of time and silence. They don't ask to be settled, yet they wait, patiently, persistently, until they are acknowledged, whether by choice or force. I had spent the previous days combing through the remnants of Professor Carver's life, piecing together fragments of a man I barely knew, though his name was spoken frequently in the halls of St. Alphege. He had been brilliant, yes, but more than that. He had been an institution in himself, respected by his peers, but distant in ways that few dared question. Even in death, Carver seemed to be one step ahead of me, as if he were watching from the shadows of his own life, waiting for me to uncover what had been hidden. It was a visit to Professor Edmund Graves' office that morning that deepened the weight of the case. Graves had been, for all intents and purposes, Carver's former colleague. They had once been close, working side by side, the intellectual pairing of their minds, the envy of their peers. But that had changed. There had been a falling out, one that, at least in public, was never fully explained. Graves had moved on, quietly, with little fanfare, and now occupied a modest teaching position in a far less prestigious corner of the college. But as I sat across from him in his cluttered office, I felt the faint stirrings of something uncomfortable, something unresolved. The room was thick with the smell of old paper and fading ink, the shelves stacked high with books that hadn't been touched in years. The only light came from a single lamp on his desk, casting long shadows across the room. Graves was seated behind the desk, his fingers tapping absently on the surface, as though he were measuring the spaces between my questions before answering them. I'd asked him about Carver, about their relationship, and he had answered with the kind of detached professionalism one expects from a man who has long since made peace with his past. But it was in the subtle hesitation that followed my mention of the falling out between them that I first noticed the debt, an unspoken acknowledgement, perhaps, of the way their relationship had fractured and, ultimately, ended. "Yes, we had our differences," Graves had said, the words rolling off his tongue like well-rehearsed lines. "But that was many years ago." I moved on. We all do. In the end, I'd watched him closely as he spoke, my gaze falling upon the old photograph that sat framed on the edge of his desk. It was a picture of him and Carver, younger, happier, a time before the shadows of their rivalry had darkened their connection. They stood together at some academic gathering, smiling as though they had not a care in the world. It was an image of intellectual companionship, of a bond that, for reasons unknown, had frayed and been forgotten. But it was the quiet pain in Graves' eyes, when he caught me looking at the photograph, that told me everything I needed to know. The debt was not financial. It was a debt of pride, of recognition, a debt Carver had left behind when he abandoned their partnership in favor of something more obscure, more dangerous. Graves did not speak of it, but I could sense the bitterness, the quiet resentment he carried with him, even now. His voice had softened when he spoke of Carver's final years, a tone that might have suggested admiration, but I knew better. There was something darker behind his words, something that had been gnawing at him for years. The fall from grace had not been kind, and Graves had been left to shoulder a burden that he could not easily lay down. I leaned forward, studying his face, noting the subtle shift in his posture as I pressed him further. "Did you ever try to reconcile with him, Professor Graves?" I asked, my voice gentle but purposeful. "Before the end?" Graves did not answer immediately. Instead, he seemed lost in thought, staring out the window, his fingers now still against the desk. The silence stretched on between us, thick and uncomfortable. It was in that silence that I understood. The unspoken debt between them had not been settled. It had been left to fester, untouched, buried beneath the weight of their egos, their pride, and perhaps even their shared failures. "No," he said at last, his voice a whisper, as though the admission were too painful to make aloud. "No, Inspector. I didn't." And there it was, the admission that spoke volumes. The debt had never been paid, not in any way that mattered. The finality of Carver's death had left them both to reckon with the past, but only one of them had been able to escape it. Graves had been left behind, carrying the weight of unresolved feelings, of a debt that could never be repaid. As I left Graves' office, the weight of his words lingered, settling into the space between my ribs, like the soft drip of rain against the stone. Carver had lived his life with a quiet arrogance, his obsession with knowledge overshadowing his relationships, his past buried beneath layers of intellectual pursuit. But it was the debts he had left behind, the debts of pride, of betrayal, that would haunt those he had left in his wake. And it was those debts, I now realized, that would lead me closer to the truth. Time, I've come to understand, is not the linear beast we like to believe it is. It circles back on itself, creeping quietly into forgotten corners, weaving together moments that should never meet. I thought of that as I walked the damp streets of Oxford one evening, the fog rising slowly from the river like some ancient secret rising from the depths. The city, as always, was both familiar and distant, its grey stone walls bearing witness to more history than most would care to recall. And yet, the weight of the past pressed down on me as I moved through the streets. It seemed to follow me, like the soft rustle of a forgotten letter just out of reach. I had been pondering the words, "Doctor." Milton had spoken to me that afternoon. The more I considered them, the more they lingered. She had told me, almost in passing, that she and Carver had once been very close, and that in his final days, his mind had become obsessed with the idea of a forgotten history. What had he been searching for? What was it that had drawn him to the occult, to the murky waters of secret knowledge? The university had always been a place where time blurred, where the past was both a relic and a living, breathing entity. Carver had always seemed to be chasing something older than himself, something rooted in the past, as if the answers to his questions lay buried there beneath centuries of dust. But what if the past, rather than offering clarity, had instead twisted itself into a labyrinth, with Carver wandering deeper into its recesses, unable to find his way out? I returned to Carver's office, now abandoned and empty, and stood for a moment in the dim light of the corridor, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. There was something unsettling about it, about the way the space had been left in such disarray, as if Carver had been in the midst of something urgent, something unfinished, when he died. The books, the papers, the scattered notes, they all told a story, though I wasn't sure it was the one he had intended to tell. As I sat at his desk, sifting through the piles of paper, I came across a curious set of notes, jotted down hastily in his hand. They appeared to be fragments of thoughts, half-formed ideas, and one line caught my attention immediately. The truth is always within reach, but never in the present. It was a strange statement, almost poetic, and yet it made sense. Carver had always seemed obsessed with the past, but what had he been trying to find? Had he been looking for something that was never meant to be found? Or was it simply that the past had become a prison for him, a place where he had sought answers until those answers began to consume him? My thoughts were interrupted by a sound, the soft creak of a floorboard behind me. I turned to see Dr. Milton standing in the doorway, her face half-shadowed by the low light. She looked smaller than I remembered, her posture hunched slightly as though the weight of something had finally begun to settle on her shoulders. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us stretched out, thick and heavy, as though it were waiting for something to break it. "I thought you might be here," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "There's something you should know." I didn't move, but I gestured for her to come in, my gaze lingering on her face. There was something about her, something I couldn't quite place, but it was in her eyes, the flicker of something buried deep beneath the surface. She stepped into the room, her footsteps soft against the old wood. "I was going through his things earlier today," she continued, her voice catching slightly. "There was one letter, one that I never should have read. It was addressed to him, but it wasn't from me." Her words were laced with hesitation, and I could sense that there was more to this than she was letting on. The letter had clearly troubled her, but why? Why would she speak of it now, with such unease? "I think it's important," she added, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity. "It was from someone in his past, someone he was trying to forget, but couldn't." I didn't respond at once, but the pieces began to fall into place. This letter, this shadow from Carver's past, had to be the key. It wasn't just his obsession with the occult that had led him down the path of his demise. It was the weight of his history, the debts he had never paid, the relationships that had come undone, and the knowledge that had driven him to the brink. As Dr. Milton handed me the letter, I couldn't help but feel the weight of its contents long before I opened it. There, in her hands, was a piece of the past that had been hiding in plain sight. The question now was whether we could find the courage to confront it, to unravel the truth before it swallowed us whole. As I read the letter, I couldn't help but wonder if Carver had known this moment would come, that the past, the very thing he had sought to escape, would always find its way back. The truth, I was beginning to understand, was never in the present. It was always waiting in the shadows of our histories, just out of reach, until the time came when it demanded to be seen. Dr. Milton stood beside me, her presence almost ethereal, as the rain began to tap lightly against the windows. It seemed as though Oxford itself was holding its breath, waiting for the story to unfold. And in that moment, I knew that the true mystery was not just in the letter, but in the paths that Carver and I had crossed, paths that had led me here, to the very heart of a secret I was only beginning to understand. We were all, it seemed, just walking through the past, waiting for it to catch up with us. There are moments in a case when a single piece of evidence can shift everything, revealing the truth in a sudden, almost violent manner. But there are other times when the truth arrives more quietly, slipping in like a shadow, slow and inevitable, waiting until it is too late to turn away. I had always been more familiar with the former, the moment of sudden clarity when everything aligns. But this case, like so many before it, seemed to demand patience. It was the quiet kind of truth that left you with more questions than answers, a kind of haunting that lingered long after the facts had been gathered. It was late when I found it. The letter tucked away in a drawer in Carver's desk, wrapped in the kind of yellowing paper that speaks to years of neglect. I had searched this room before, of course, but it had been the kind of search you undertake when you expect to find nothing. The books had been looked through, the files rifled through, the desk combed for anything useful, and yet there it was, waiting for me. A single letter, addressed simply, with no name, no return address. I picked it up carefully, noting the faint indentation of the words beneath the paper, the kind of detail that one might overlook if they weren't paying attention. The letter had been folded over many times, as though it had been carried and read countless times. I could see the creases running through it, deep and well-worn, and I wondered how many times Carver had read the words within before he had finally set it down, before he had let it become part of the dust of his past. The letter itself was brief, but the meaning of it was anything but. It was written in a careful hand, each word measured, deliberate. I felt the weight of the silence in those lines, the deliberate withholding of any explanation. There were no grand revelations, no confessions of guilt. Instead, there was just a quiet acknowledgement of something that had been left unspoken for far too long. "The truth will out," it began, "but the cost will be far greater than either of us can bear. I cannot face what is coming. The past cannot be undone, but I fear that in uncovering it, we will lose more than we are willing to sacrifice. There is no turning back. Not now." The words were almost a whisper, a murmur to the dead, but they carried with them the weight of a finality that could not be ignored. The handwriting, I noticed, had become more erratic toward the end, the last words barely legible. It was as though Carver had written these lines in a feverish panic, the gravity of his decision, or perhaps the weight of his conscience, finally catching up with him. It wasn't just the words themselves, though, that struck me. It was the knowledge that Carver had known that he was on the verge of something dangerous, something that could not be left in the open. He had feared something, or someone, and yet he had left this letter behind, as if hoping that someone might find it after it was too late. The implications of the letter began to settle in like a slow burn. Who had Carver been addressing? Who had he been warning? Dr. Milton had seemed so certain that Carver's obsession with the occult had led him to his death, but I couldn't help but feel that there was something else, something older, something deeper. This wasn't just about philosophy or hidden knowledge. This was personal. The past that Carver had been trying to bury had a far more intimate connection to the present than anyone had realized. I sat back in the chair, the letter still clutched in my hand. The quiet hum of the night outside, the soft rustle of the rain against the windows, seemed to carry with it the echoes of Carver's final words. There was no turning back, no easy way to unravel the web of secrets he had woven. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about knowledge. This was about guilt, about a debt Carver had tried to pay in some way, but never had. A debt that had only grown heavier with time until it had consumed him entirely. The city outside felt smaller somehow, as though the weight of its history was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. I'd hoped for clarity in this case, for the kind of resolution that would bring peace, but I was beginning to understand that there would be no such resolution. No neat ending, just fragments, just shadows of the past, waiting to be brought to light. And so I sat there, in Carver's office, the letter before me, the weight of its finality settling in. In some ways, it was the answer I had been seeking all along, but in other ways, it was nothing more than another question, one that would lead me further down the path, deeper into the shadows, where the past had already left its mark. The truth, I thought, has a way of hiding in the most unlikely places. And it is only when you stop running from it, when you allow it to catch up with you, that you truly begin to understand what it has cost. The trouble with a case like this, one built on whispers and half-secrets, is that it has a way of changing shape when you're not looking. It is as if the very nature of the mystery is to shift just out of reach, to become an elusive shadow you can never quite corner. I had reached a point, perhaps too late, where I realized that I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the moment when it would all unravel, when the carefully constructed walls of everyone's lies would finally fall. I walked back to the university on that wet afternoon, the rain falling in a steady, rhythmic drizzle, the kind of rain that soaks through your coat and into your bones but doesn't offer any clarity. I had hoped, in the back of my mind, that I might stumble upon some sudden, glaring inconsistency, some missing piece that would break the case wide open. But the more I thought about it, the less sure I was that the answer would be simple. There was no dramatic moment of realization waiting for me. There was only the slow tightening of the web. Dr. Milton's reaction to the letter I had found in Carver's office still lingered in my thoughts. I could see her in my mind's eye, her carefully cultivated poise, the faint tremble in her hands when she handed me that final document. I had caught a glimpse of something deeper in her then, something she hadn't meant to reveal. It was not just Carver's obsession with the occult that had drawn her in. There was a personal attachment, a connection far beyond academic interest. The letter, like the manuscript, seemed to indicate a past she hadn't shared with anyone. But then there was Professor Graves. There, too, was the lingering suspicion, the undercurrent of bitterness and resentment that he had never fully buried. His relationship with Carver had ended in silence, yet I could see the cracks in the facade every time I spoke to him. The way his fingers lingered on that old photograph, the way he hesitated just for a second too long before giving his answers. That momentary pause, the flash of something unspoken, it was too much for me to ignore. Still, it was Dr. Milton who dominated my thoughts. She had been so careful with her words, so distant in her explanations, yet there was something more there, something beneath the surface. I could not help but wonder, was she protecting someone? Or was she herself the one in need of protection? I made my way to her office once more, my coat damp from the walk, my mind buzzing with fragments of conversations and half-formed theories. The door was open when I arrived, the faint scent of ink and old paper hanging in the air. She was sitting at her desk, her back to me, but she didn't need to turn around for me to see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched ever so slightly, as though she was bracing for something. "You're persistent, Inspector," she said, her voice calm but with a note of something else. "Perhaps fatigue, perhaps fear. I'm afraid I have nothing more to add." I did not answer immediately. Instead, I closed the door softly behind me and walked over to where she sat. I could feel the weight of her silence pressing down upon me, the quiet room filled with the subtle weight of unspoken things. "I'm not here to press you," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "I'm here to ask you something, Doctor. Milton, something important. You and Carver, there was more between you than just academic collaboration, wasn't there? You were involved in something far more personal, something that you've kept hidden." She looked up at me then, her eyes sharp, but there was a flicker in them, an almost imperceptible shift, as if she had been caught off guard by the question. She didn't answer, but for the first time, I saw a slight tremor in her hands as she set the papers down. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" she said, her voice quiet but firm, as though she had resigned herself to the inevitability of the situation. "There's no way I can convince you otherwise." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was, I was beginning to see it too, beginning to see how all the pieces, once scattered and disjointed, were slowly starting to fit together. But the image they were creating was far more complex than I had imagined. The shadows of the past, the debts left unpaid, the secret history Carver had been trying to bury. It was all coming into focus, but it was not yet clear enough for me to see it fully. "You have to understand, Doctor," Milton continued, her voice trembling just slightly now. Carver was never meant to get so deep into this. He was a man of reason once, but in the end, he lost himself. We both did her words hung in the air, but I felt no closer to the truth. No closer to understanding the full scope of their relationship or of the mystery surrounding Carver's death. All I had was this slow tightening of the web, each strand leading me down a darker path than the one before. I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I paused. "One last thing, Doctor." "Milton," I said, my voice almost a whisper. "You didn't answer my question. You're not just hiding the truth about Carver's death, you're hiding the truth about what came before it." Her gaze met mine, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw something close to regret or perhaps fear, flicker behind her eyes. But it was gone before I could be sure. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stepped back into the rain-soaked streets of Oxford, the city holding its breath as the web continued to tighten, drawing us all closer to something we were too afraid to acknowledge. There comes a point in every investigation, a moment when the questions stop echoing and the answers begin to take shape, albeit in the most unexpected form. It wasn't as if I had cracked the case wide open, no, it was subtler than that. It was more like the slow, steady unveiling of something you had always known was there but couldn't quite bring yourself to believe. The final reveal rarely offers a sense of triumph or relief, but rather a quiet, unsettling awareness that all the pieces have fallen into place, yet they do not form the picture you had hoped for. I was standing in Carver's office once more, the rain lashing against the window, a constant drumbeat to the rhythm of my thoughts. The city outside seemed far away, as if a veil had descended between me and the rest of the world. The letter I had found, the one doctor Milton had handed me, the cryptic note Carver had left behind, all of it had been like breadcrumbs scattered across a trail that led somewhere dark, somewhere hidden. And now, as I stood there, I felt it closing in, the suffocating weight of it pressing down on me. The door creaked open, and I turned to see Doctor Milton standing there, her eyes slightly red, her expression tired but resolute. There was no pretense left in her now, no polished facade of detachment. She looked, if I may put it bluntly, like a woman who had spent far too long hiding from a truth she could no longer avoid. "You are right," she said quietly, her voice breaking the stillness between us. It wasn't just about Carver's obsession with the occult. It was about the past, a past he tried to bury. I nodded slowly, taking in her words, but I had known it all along. The pieces, as I said, had always been there, hidden in plain sight. I'd only needed to let the silence speak, to allow the words to surface in their own time. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her, and placed a small leather-bound journal on the desk between us. It was worn, its edges frayed, the cover scratched with age. I could tell immediately that this was something important, something Carver had kept close, something personal. "This was his," she continued, "but I'm afraid I never truly understood the significance of it. Until now I opened the journal carefully, feeling the weight of its history in my hands. The pages were filled with Carver's handwriting, but this was not the scholarly prose I'd grown used to seeing in his lectures. No, this was different. This was raw, unfiltered. There were mentions of strange rituals, of old acquaintances whose names seemed to slip from the pages like forgotten ghosts. But it was the final entry that caught my eye, an entry that, in hindsight, felt like a warning. "I've uncovered too much. There's no going back now. I've made enemies, enemies from a past that will never die. They have followed me, and they will stop at nothing to silence me. The truth is buried in the oldest corners of this city, and it will take more than just one life to keep it hidden." Her voice interrupted my thoughts, soft yet insistent. "He knew, Inspector. He knew that his quest for knowledge would lead him to something far darker than he ever anticipated. I could feel the pieces shifting now. a sense of clarity beginning to emerge. Carver's obsession had been more than intellectual. It had been personal, a way to confront the mistakes he had made, the lives he had touched in ways that could never be undone. His quest for truth had led him to unearth something ancient, something that should never have been brought to light. But there was more, much more. The question wasn't just about what Carver had found. It was about who he had crossed in the process. There were people, I realized, who had everything to lose if the truth came to light. And it was these people, not Carver, who were the true architects of the mystery. The journal, in its quiet way, had answered the questions I had been asking all along. It confirmed my suspicions, but it also raised new ones. Carver had discovered something so dangerous that it could not be allowed to exist in the open. But even in his final hours, he had not understood the full extent of what he had unearthed. He had been, in the end, just another player in a much older game. I closed the journal with a soft snap and looked up at Dr. Milton. Her eyes, once so guarded, now seemed to hold a depth of regret, of sorrow that she had never allowed anyone to see. "You should have told me sooner," I said quietly, though the words were not an accusation, merely a recognition of what had already transpired. "But you were protecting him, weren't you? Protecting his secrets, his legacy. Even now you still are." She nodded, her eyes downcast. "There are things in this city, things from a time long past, that must remain buried. Some secrets are too dangerous to unearth." The room fell silent, save for the rain tapping gently against the window. I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me, but I also knew that it wasn't finished. Not yet. This was only the beginning. The past Carver had uncovered, the debt he had tried to repay, the people involved, they were all still out there, lurking in the shadows. And I had no doubt that the storm was far from over. As I left her office, the truth, though clear, was as elusive as the rain-soaked streets outside. It was not the kind of truth that would bring closure, not yet and perhaps never. But the case had taken its final shape. All I had to do now was follow it through to its end, wherever that might lead, 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 wherever that